Friedman to start us off. Edie is founder and the executive director of the Jewish Council for Racial Equality, which we normally know as JCORE. She regularly speaks and writes on race and asylum issues, and she's authored and co-authored books and educational resources, and is looked to by much of the Jewish community for an authoritative voice on issues around migration. Edie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mike. And if we could have the first slide up, please. So what I'm going to do very briefly this evening is to give you just a snapshot of the Nationality and Borders Bill, share with you some of concerns that we have, and say how JCORE and others within the Jewish community have responded, and also relate it to the situation facing refugees from Afghanistan and the Ukraine. And finally, to end up some suggestions of what we could do about the bill. Next slide, please. Right, so we know we have this legislation because Priti Patel and the government has told us that the asylum system is broken. And indeed, it has many, many problems, such as the lack of safe routes, such as the fact that over 600 children, young people live in unregulated hotels, that child refugees are left in hotels without shoes, without spare clothing, without accommodation, without health care, and a lone child goes missing from one of these unregulated hotels on average every week. Families as well are placed in dangerous accommodation, and we know the tragic death of a boy last year. And of course, there are long delays in dealing with asylum claims. Next slide, please. So the Borders Bill, as Micah said, outlines some very worrying proposals for so-called reform of the asylum system. And of course, many of us from minority communities, not only the Jewish community, are the children or grandchildren of refugees who would not been able to come to Britain if such legislation had been in place. And it is a very costly thing to implement. Estimates that it will cost £2.7 billion to actually implement. Next slide, please. So I just want to outline 6 reasons why we should oppose the bill. It creates a 2-tier asylum system. It ends the automatic right to claim asylum. It limits family reunion. It provides less protection for child refugees. It expands the asylum accommodation estate, and it punishes people who seek asylum and those who try to help them. Next slide, please. So our response, and others within the Jewish community, is we sent a petition to the Prime Minister. We've had many letters signed by rabbis from across the community. We've had letters signed by Jewish lawyers. We did a joint statement with the Board of Deputies, Reni Kassan and World Jewish Relief, a letter published in The Guardian. We responded to the original consultation, which was a very complicated thing to do. We organized a panel discussion with Lord Elf Dubs and Andrew Solomon, the head of the Refugee Council. We've written to all Jewish parliamentarians in both the Commons and the Lords. And most recently, 40 rabbis signed a letter with over 1,000 faith leaders, which was sent to the Prime Minister. Next slide, please. So, Operation Warm Welcome. So connected to all of this is the scheme that was announced in August to bring in people from Afghanistan. And there's supposed to be 2 schemes, the Afghan Relocation and Assistance, if we could go back, an assistance policy, and the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme. And the first scheme, ARAP, was for people who had some connection with the British state. And the second scheme prioritizes, if it actually existed, those who stood up for democracy, women's rights, freedom of expression, and rule of law. And it was directed at extremely vulnerable people, such as women and girls. And that second scheme is supposed to have 3 pathways, but it hasn't actually been activated. Next slide, please. So how warm is Operation Warm Welcome? it's been estimated that about 13,000 people from Afghanistan have arrived from the first scheme. 5,000 people should have arrived from the second scheme before Christmas, which would be out of the 20,000 that Boris Johnson said we would be accepting. Now the 5,000 never arrived, and the 5,000 figure is going into part of the 13,000. So there's a lot of creative accounting going on. So there's real questions about what about those Afghans who have arrived across the channel through so-called irregular routes. People are put in quarantine for 10 days and then in bridging hotels, but great anxiety that some people will be there for up to a year, if not longer. Some people have found it such a stressful situation that they've actually asked to go back to Afghanistan. Huge mental health problems. It's been pretty much left to local authorities and private contractors to actually organize the resettlement. And there's been a lot of frustration and anger, even among some Tory MPs. Next slide, please. So JCORE has started to coordinate offers of practical support and goods. People may be aware that a synagogue in Bushi had a huge collection of clothing, and it was so successful they had to stop it before it finished. And then there's a logistical problem of how to sort the clothing, how to distribute it, etc. So we organized an emergency appeal because we said that money was more helpful than providing clothing. We had an open letter which we sent to Boris Johnson, signed by over 300 people, but there's real questions about what else we should be doing. Next slide, please. So we really need to act now for Afghan refugees, because one of the ramifications of the Ukraine situation is that the Afghan situation has been put even further on the back burner. So we are asking for some updates on what is happening to Afghan this scheme. Urgently, we're asking about what is happening to families who are moving out of these so-called bridging hotels. People need to know where they're going to go, whether it's the Outer Hebrides or Devon, Cornwall. People need help with employment. They need English classes. They need mental health support, and they need family reunion rights. Next slide, please.
2 minutes, please, Edie.
Right. So the situation with Ukrainian refugees, over 1.5 million have now left the Ukraine. Estimates there might be 7 million people who've left. 12 million people will need assistance within the Ukraine. And the Prime Minister said we could take up to 200,000, but we really don't believe that. And Britain has been criticized for not having such as generous scheme as the EU has had. Next slide, please. So there are questions about what we could do within the Jewish community. Should we and how should we be using our own refugee experience as basis of campaigning? How are we involved in rehabilitating the whole notion of asylum? And how do we also at the same time speak out about other issues such as inequality, racism, etc. Next slide, please. So our forecast is that we need to amend the bill and certainly remove clause 11. We need to support Elf Dubs, who's asking for a resettlement target of 10,000 people. We need to back any amendments which would remove the bill's power to use offshore processing places such as Rwanda, and we have to make sure the military does not patrol the channel. And as we know, the House of Lords have backed and supported a number of amendments on child refugees, getting rid of clause level, asking that the UK government actually honor its commitment from the 1951 Refugee Convention. And next slide, please. And the next slide, please. So there was a lot for us. Unfortunately, the House of Lords have acted in a much more admirable way than the House of Commons. They have introduced and supported a number of very important amendments, which we need to reinforce. But we have one hell of a job, and we are part of a coalition of over 300 refugee and migrant organizations trying to defeat the bill. But it's a colossal task. Thank you very much.